The senses are pretty amazing things, I think. You know, our ability to see and to hear and taste and all those kind of things. One of the things that I find fairly amazing, I'll do the fairly amazing first, then the very amazing. One of the things that I find fairly amazing is how transparent our sensory apparatus is. You know, it doesn't. I guess the processing is so seamless and so complex and so well evolved that we don't even notice the fact that any processing is taking place. It doesn't feel like my eyes are doing any seeing here, or my visual system is. It just feels like there's a kind of porthole in the front of my face which is accessing the world. That's kind of how it feels. And the same thing with my ears. They don't feel like sense organs. They just feel like holes in the side of my head that the sound pours in through. And similarly with all of my senses, which is you know, that transparent. I think it's deceptive, that transparency, because it makes us think we have this this unproblematic access to the real world, and it's encouraging of a kind of naive realism, which isn't always useful. But it is completely astonishing that we can do that, and it's a mark of the complexity of our cognitive systems that it is so invisible to us. I mean, that's what I think is fairly amazing. The thing that I found incredibly amazing, I have to say, is something I may have talked about before, I can't always remember, which is depth perception. Depth perception. The fact I can look out across this canal here towards those houses, or beyond the houses to the copse of trees beyond, and to the kind of mist over there on the horizon, or the cows over there. And these things seem to be laying themselves out in a third dimension. Is amazing. And the thing I find amazing about it, or the reason why I find that particularly useful actually, is because for me at least it's not quite as transparent as the other senses I talked about. It's not quite as transparent as kind of closing one eye and just seeing the world, or as just hearing things happen. When I see the depth, I kind of have to know that this is not happening in my senses. I know none of this stuff's happening in my senses, but it's kind of unavoidable that depth perception is a result of my cognitive apparatus. It's not just a natural function of an eyeball, and it's not some automatic accessing of the world out there. But I just explain what I mean by that. I mean, the way that at least the kind of depth perception I'm talking about is, you know, we've got two eyes set 3 inches apart. Because they're slightly separate, the images cast by the light reflected from the world onto those, the retinas at the back of those eyes is slightly different, so a slightly different image in my left and right eye. What I think is called retinal disparity in the literature, I think it's called that. So slightly different images. The cells, the retinal cells at the back of the eye, are they send their signals to the various visual centres of the brain, but they send them back there in pairs, so different. So the corresponding cells in each eye send whatever they're receiving back to the same neuronal area, so that those two signals, those two images, if you like, if you collectivise them, are a kind of. Well, yeah, that's where the magic happens, really, as they say on cribs, isn't it? These two images go back, they kind of lie down together and give birth to this third dimension because of the, I presume, some kind of mathematical process that extracts the difference between those and presents it to consciousness, if that's the right way of describing that, as an experience of depth. But the reason why I say that's slightly less transparent is because if I close one eye, that depth just disappears. Well, the depth clues are still there, you know, to do with size and all those kind of things, but the depth clue from binocular vision just disappears. So all that calculation is gone, so it's clearly not part of my eye. It's not part of that just routine accessing of the world. It springs into being when I open the second eye. That depth dimension just comes into being when I do that, which is amazing, really, because I'm not seeing anything I wasn't seeing anywhere. This is what I've talked about before with Polanyi, talking about subsidiary and focal awareness. I'm getting subsidiary awareness from each eye, those two separate images I've talked about. But the focal awareness, what I'm actually aware of, I'm not seeing from either eye. I'm seeing only in my brain. The action of my brain dramatising that difference and making it available to me as depth, which is, as I say, for me, completely gobsmacking. I find that quite useful in many ways, actually. That effect really, as a kind of analogy for all sorts of different things. I'm not sure I've got the oomph to talk about it right now, but the fact that we do seem to be able to gain access to a kind of experience of the world which is completely real, as much as anything else is, and completely experiential, but is self-evidently the product of cognitive processes, I find really useful. You know, we kind of invent the third dimension on a moment-to-moment basis, and that is completely evident to us. Yeah, as I say, I think of that as an analogy for other things, which perhaps I'll talk about again. Okay, I'll just return to this thing about depth perception. I'll see if I can stick this on the end of the last video. So I hadn't really realised how short that last video was. But it was, so just to return, depth perception, product of two eyes, completely cognitive process, self-evidently a cognitive process in a way that, for me at least, other more transparent sensory engagements with the world are transparent. And the fact that depth emerges as an experience in the world out of that process, I find useful as an analogy. So what kind of analogous things can I think of? Well, I kind of find myself doing little thought experiments with that idea. Like, for example, what would it be like if instead of our eyes being 3 inches apart, they were slightly wider apart? Or maybe a lot wider apart. What if they were like 3 feet apart? But they still functioned in the same way. You know, I was still resolving differences, still creating depth out of that. If they were 3 feet apart, and I had an object here where my hand is, you know, like a foot in front of my face, I'll be able to see almost all of that object simultaneously. Right now, even with depth perception, my eyes 3 inches apart, I can see the front of my hand, but I can't see the back of it. But if my eyes were 3 feet apart, and if they were capable of swivelling, and assuming I had the cognitive hardware or software to run the, to kind of run that program that works out the differences and presents it as depth, then I'd be able to see a three-dimensional object from both sides. And if they were further apart, you know, if my eyes were somehow on long stalks, 3 miles apart, and had access to you know, a much more complicated swivelling mechanism perhaps. But again, there were, you know, the inputs from both eyes was mapped and sent to the same neurons and did the whole thing of lying side by side and giving birth to a third dimension. Then I'm not even sure I'd call it depth. I'm not even sure if I'd know where I was at that point actually, because I wouldn't be at the focal point of that parallax. You know, I'm not sure if the focal point's the right word, but I wouldn't be at that position in the parallax anymore. I would be distributed across a wider space, but I would certainly, I guess, be able to see this weird world. It would kind of present itself to whatever I was at that point, if I was 3 miles apart. And there could be much further than that. There could be, well, I could have an eye at one end of the universe, and one at the, no, actually, opposite ends of the universe wouldn't be interesting. It'd be interesting if I had an eye where it is now, at the phenomenal logical centre of the universe, and then an eye as far out as you can get. It wouldn't be an eye as we understand it, but an eye as far out as you can get at the limits of the peripheral universe. And these are fantastically developed eyes, of course, that can see for billions of miles. Then the kind of depth that would spring into view almost magically with that extended parallax would be, I guess, something like Nagel's view from nowhere, or view from everywhere. You know, it'd be simultaneously the centre and the periphery of everything. I would be seeing things simultaneously from the centre and the periphery, and resolving distinctions between centre and periphery, between subject and object, or between the ultimate subject and the ultimate object. into some kind of experience analogous with the experience of depth. I'm not sure if that makes any sense at all.